The paper was already signed when I saw it. My name, Clara Whitfield, written in blue ink at the bottom of a notarized transfer document, the signature looping in a way I recognized as almost mine. Almost. I'm a paralegal. I've spent 15 years reading documents that most people skim. I know what my own signature looks like. I know the angle of the C, the way the L runs slightly below the baseline, the small break I always leave between Clara and Whitfield, a habit from my first job, when my supervisor told me a clean break makes forgery harder. There was no break in this signature. I'm Clara. I'm 38 years old, and I was standing in my mother's kitchen in Medford, Oregon, holding a document that transferred my legal interest in our family property to my older sister Dana, a document I had never seen before and had certainly never signed. My mother was at the stove. The smell of onions softening in butter filled the room. The window above the sink was fogged with steam, the November light outside flat and gray. Everything looked exactly the way it had always looked, the rooster clock above the refrigerator, the ceramic flour jar shaped like a sheaf of wheat, the faded calendar still showing October because nobody had turned the page. I had stood in this kitchen 10,000 times. I knew every scratch on the linoleum floor. And yet something in the air felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately locate. Mom. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Where did this come from? She turned from the stove. She was wearing her blue apron, the one with the faded strawberries, and her expression was the same expression she'd worn my entire life when she was trying not to take sides, eyes slightly averted, mouth arranged in careful neutrality. Dana brought it by last week. She said it was just paperwork. Clearing up the deed. Clearing up the deed, I repeated. She said you'd already signed your copy. I looked down at the document again. The notary stamp was dated 14 months ago. 14 months. I had been living 30 miles away, working at Harmon and Associates, eating lunch at my desk, driving home through the same intersection every evening, and somewhere in that ordinary life, my signature had appeared on a legal document without my knowledge. I set the paper down on the table very carefully, the way you set something down when you're afraid of what you might do if you grip it any longer. The rooster clock ticked. My mother turned back to the stove. I didn't say anything else. I took a photo of the document with my phone, folded it exactly as I'd found it, and placed it back in the manila envelope on the counter. Then I sat down and ate dinner with my mother and talked about the neighbor's new dog and whether the weather would turn before Thanksgiving. I was already thinking about everything I would do in the morning. Dana and I had never been the kind of sisters who fought openly. That's worth saying clearly, because it shaped everything. The way conflict moved between us was never loud. It ran underground, like water finding the path of least resistance through stone. By the time you noticed the damage, the route had been established for years. She was 41, 3 years older, and she had always occupied a specific position in our family, the one who handled things. After our father died 8 years ago, Dana became the person our mother called first. Dana arranged the funeral. Dana sorted the bank accounts. Dana made the decisions that needed making while I drove down from Portland, where I was finishing my paralegal certification, and contributed what I could from the outside. That division of labor had felt natural at the time. Practical. Our mother was 61 and fragile with grief, and someone had to take charge. I didn't understand until much later how thoroughly that role had been cultivated. Dana was a real estate agent. She'd been one for almost 15 years, working mostly residential properties in Jackson County but occasionally reaching into adjacent markets when something profitable came up. She drove a silver SUV she'd leased 3 years ago and lived in a house she described as almost paid off to anyone who asked, which I eventually realized was not the same thing as saying it was paid off. She dressed carefully. She knew how to make things look a certain way. I thought I knew her. I'd thought that for 38 years. The family property, the thing at the center of all of this, was a 2-acre parcel on the south edge of Medford that our grandfather had purchased in 1961. An old farmhouse sat on half of it, the rest was undeveloped land that had quietly tripled in value over the past decade as the city expanded south. Our fathers will had divided it equally between Dana and me, with our mother retaining the right to live in the farmhouse for the duration of her life. Simple. Clean. Notarized and filed with the county. It had never once occurred to me that the document could be undone. In the weeks after I found the forged transfer, I went back to work and said nothing. I ate lunch at my desk and ran property records in my spare time, which was not difficult because I did it professionally every day. What I found took me 3 evenings to fully understand. The transfer document I'd found in my mother's kitchen was one of 2. The second had been filed with Jackson County 11 months earlier. Together they transferred my half-interest in the property entirely to Dana, cleanly, with notarized signatures on both, filed within the standard window, no flags raised. On paper, I no longer owned anything. Something tightened in my chest when I understood the full shape of it. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to cold recognition. The kind of feeling that arrives when you realize a thing has already happened, and you were the last to know. I thought about the last time I'd seen Dana. 2 months earlier, at our mother's birthday dinner. She'd poured wine and told a story about a difficult client and laughed at the right moments. She'd hugged me at the door when I left and said we should do this more often. I had agreed. I called it warmth then. Looking back now, I'd call it performance. The thing about being a paralegal is that you spend your career learning how documents lie. Not in dramatic ways, not forged signatures on movie contracts or stolen wills hidden in floor saffrolls. The lies in legal documents are almost always technical. A date shifted by a month. An address with a subtle error. A notary stamp from a county office that issued a license to someone who retired 4 years ago. The deception is in the detail no one thinks to check. I started checking everything. The notary whose stamp appeared on the forged document was a woman named Patricia Oak, licensed in Jackson County. I found her license number in the state database and cross-referenced it with the filing date. Patricia Oak's license had been inactive for 22 months at the time the stamp was used. She'd let it lapse in January of the previous year. The stamp on my forged signature was dated November, 10 months after the license died. A dead notary stamp. 14-month-old paperwork. 2 county filings, both clean on the surface. Someone had been careful. But not careful enough. I sat with that information for 4 days before I did anything with it. I went to work. I made coffee. I drove past the intersection at Oak and Center Street every evening and watched the traffic light cycle through its colors. I was afraid, though I wouldn't have called it that at the time. I would have said I was being thorough, being methodical, making sure before I moved. What I was actually doing was buying time before the world I thought I lived in stopped existing. On the 5th day, I called Meg. Meg had been my closest friend for 11 years. We'd met in a continuing education class, bonded over a mutual dislike of the instructor, and had been inside each other's lives ever since. She knew about my father's death and my mother's house and the property. She knew about Dana in the way you know about someone you've heard described for a decade, the stories, the patterns, the long history of small imbalances I'd never fully named out loud. I told her everything. The document, the dead notary stamp, the county filings, the dates that didn't match. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "Clara," she said finally. "Are you sure?" "I'm a paralegal," I said. "Yes." Another silence. Something in it felt heavier than it should have. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I said. "I think I need to talk to someone official." "Don't do anything too fast," Meg said. "Dana is still your sister." I thanked her. I got off the phone. I stood in my kitchen for a while, looking at nothing in particular. I didn't ask myself why that felt wrong. I should have. I didn't go to the police first. I went to Gerald Holt. Gerald was the attorney who'd handled my father's estate, a careful, deliberate man in his late 60s who wore the same style of wool blazer regardless of the season and kept an office that smelled faintly of old paper and machine coffee. He'd known our family since before I was born. He had prepared the original will. I brought him copies of everything: the forged transfer, the county filings, the notary license records, a timeline I'd built across 3 pages of legal paper. He read it without speaking. He took his glasses off and cleaned them twice, which I'd learned years ago meant he was processing something serious. Then he set the documents down and looked at me with an expression I recognized from 15 years of working in legal offices, the particular stillness of someone who has just understood that a situation is worse than originally presented. "The notary stamp is the clearest problem," he said. "Everything else requires forensic handwriting analysis to confirm. But a lapsed license on a filed document, that's documentary. That's something a county recorder should have caught and didn't." "Why didn't they?" "Because no one was looking." He folded his hands. "Clara, do you understand what you're describing here? This isn't a clerical error." "I know what it is." "Have you spoken to Dana?" "No." "Your mother?" "No." He nodded slowly. "There's something else you should know," he said. He opened a drawer and produced a folder, his own folder, not mine, and slid a single page across the desk. "Dana came to see me 8 weeks ago. She wanted to discuss a potential sale of the property to a commercial developer. A solar installation company, expanding south. The parcel would be worth approximately $900,000 in the current market." I stared at the number. "She represented herself as the sole owner," Gerald said quietly. "I told her I'd need to review the deed status. She said she'd send documentation." He paused. "She never did." $900,000. The rooster clock. The foggy window. My mother standing at the stove, not looking at me. I hadn't put it all together yet. But something had already broken. I left Gerald's office and drove to the county recorder's office and requested the complete filing history for the property parcel. The clerk brought me a folder 40 minutes later, and I sat at a public table and read through it. In addition to the 2 transfer documents, there was a third filing I hadn't known about, a preliminary title report, ordered 8 months ago by a company called Crestline Land Partners, LLC. Crestline Land Partners, LLC was registered in Nevada. Its registered agent was a man named Thomas Farley. I took a photograph of that name and typed it into my phone. Thomas Farley was Dana's boyfriend of 2 years. I drove home. I made tea I didn't drink. I sat at my kitchen table until the light changed and thought about all the dinners, all the phone calls, all the moments I'd read as ordinary and now understood as something else entirely. The patience required to plan something like this over months. The discipline to keep your face arranged correctly at your mother's birthday dinner while the county filings were already in motion. I understood then that I hadn't been reading our relationship wrong. I'd been reading it through the version of Dana I needed her to be, not the version she actually was. The next morning, I called the FBI field office in Portland. Special Agent Marcus Renfield arrived at my apartment on a Thursday morning. He was younger than I'd expected, mid-40s, unhurried, with the quality of attention that some people develop over years of listening to things that don't add up. He sat at my kitchen table and went through my documentation with a focus that felt almost identical to Gerald Holt's, except that where Gerald had been careful, Renfield was clinical. He asked questions in the flat, specific way of someone who already knows most of the answers. The fraud, he told me, was larger than I'd known. The property was one piece. Over the preceding 3 years, Dana and Thomas Farley had filed fraudulent transfer documents on 4 properties in Jackson and Josephine counties, all involving either elderly owners or out-of-state co-owners who were unlikely to monitor county filings routinely. My parcel was the highest value target. 2 of the other properties had already been sold through shell companies. The proceeds had moved through 3 accounts before landing somewhere Renfield declined to specify while the investigation was active. I sat with that and said nothing for a moment. "Your sister has been doing this professionally," Renfield said. Not unkindly. Just precisely. The notary stamp came from a former colleague who kept the physical stamp after the license lapsed. The colleague has already been interviewed. Who is the colleague? He looked at me for a moment before answering. A woman named Margaret Fowler, he said. She goes by Meg. The room didn't change. The light didn't shift. The table was still the table, the chair was still the chair. Everything looked exactly as it had 30 seconds earlier, and yet something had fundamentally rearranged. Meg. 11 years. The continuing education class, the shared dislike of the instructor, the decade of Sunday phone calls and birthday dinners, and the one winter she'd stayed with me for 2 weeks after her own marriage ended and I'd made soup every night because I didn't know what else to do. Even now, something uncomfortable moves through me when I think about that moment. Not just the betrayal, the architecture of it. The years of genuine warmth threaded through with something I was never supposed to see. She provided the stamp, Renfield continued, and notarized at least 2 of the 4 documents. She had a financial arrangement with your sister. How long? My voice was level. I was proud of that. We believe since the beginning. Since the first filing. Since before I'd called her. Since before I'd told her everything I'd found, every piece of documentation, every thread I was still following. The call. Don't do anything too fast. Dana is still your sister. She'd been buying time. For Dana. Renfield left me with a contact number and a list of next steps and an instruction not to contact Dana or Meg directly. I walked him to the door and shook his hand and closed the door and stood in my hallway for a long time. Then I called my mother. That conversation was the hardest of all, not because of what I had to tell her, but because of what she said when I finished. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I wondered, Clara. I didn't want to know, but I wondered. She had noticed something, some months ago. Dana had asked her to sign a document at the kitchen table, quickly, just a formality, don't worry about the details. My mother had signed. She hadn't asked what she was signing because Dana was her daughter and daughters didn't deceive their mothers and some truths are too large to approach directly. I understood then something I hadn't expected to feel, not anger at my mother, but a kind of grief for the impossible position she'd been put in, the cruelty of being made complicit in your own deception without ever being given the information to refuse. 3 weeks after my conversation with Renfield, Dana was arrested at Thomas Farley's residence in Ashland. Farley was arrested the same morning. Meg was taken into custody at her workplace in Medford. I found out from Gerald Holt, who called me on a Friday afternoon. The property case took 14 months to resolve in civil court. What the criminal proceedings took longer, and I won't pretend I watched all of it closely, there's a limit to how much of your own life you can observe as evidence. Dana was charged with wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Farley faced the same charges plus money laundering. Meg pled to a reduced charge in exchange for cooperation and received probation and community service, which felt insufficient and probably was. My half-interest in the property was restored through a court order voiding both fraudulent transfers. The parcel was eventually sold, not to Crestline Land Partners, but through a legitimate real estate transaction that Gerald facilitated, with my mother's interests protected throughout. My share was just over $400,000. I don't spend much time thinking about the money. What I think about more is the kitchen table. My mother's kitchen table, the scratched pine one she's had since before I was born, the one where Dana spread those papers and told her it was just formality and my mother had signed because you sign things your children bring you, because trust is the foundation all families build on and you don't usually discover the rot until you put your weight on the wrong board. My mother still lives in the farmhouse. I visit most Sundays. We have dinner, and we talk about the neighbor's dog and the weather and whatever small things fill the week. We don't talk about Dana much. There's an understanding between us that has no words, a shared knowledge of what happened, and a shared decision about how much of it we want to carry forward. Dana sent me a letter from the county facility where she was held during the trial. I read it once. It was less an apology than an explanation, a careful account of financial pressure, of Thomas's influence, of circumstances that had felt inescapable. Maybe some of it was true. I've spent enough time with legal documents to know the difference between a confession and a narrative constructed to survive. I wrote back one sentence: "I hope you find a way to live with what you did." I don't know if that was generous or insufficient. I'm not sure it matters. What I do know is that I walked out of the courthouse on the day the civil judgment was entered, and the air smelled like rain coming in from the south, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and felt something I can only describe as the opposite of weight. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter. The specific relief of a thing finally resolved, of carrying a truth no one wanted to hear and being believed. I drove home through the intersection at Oakland Center. The traffic light cycled through its colors. I waited for green. I thought about my grandfather buying that land in 1961, some calculation he'd made about the future, some belief that a piece of earth held unprotected was worth something beyond its market value. He wasn't wrong about that. He just couldn't have known what the protection would eventually cost. I kept driving. What this story reveals, at its core, is not simply a crime, it's the particular vulnerability that family closeness creates. Clara wasn't naive. She was a paralegal with 15 years of experience reading documents for deception. She had the professional skills to catch exactly what she caught. What she lacked was the psychological permission to apply those skills to the people she loved, and that gap, between competence and willingness, is where Dana built everything. The scheme required years of groundwork that wasn't primarily financial. It required Dana to occupy a specific role in the family, the one who handles things, the one who manages logistics, the one our mother calls first. That role wasn't seized. It was cultivated, patiently, across 8 years following their father's death. Each time Dana managed a difficulty, each time she stepped in while Clara was away, she was quietly establishing a credibility that would later function as a cover. The family's trust in her was real. It had been earned through real behavior. That's what made it so difficult to question, and so effective as a foundation for fraud. The Meg dimension adds another layer entirely. 11 years of genuine friendship, real warmth, real presence, real history, coexisting with a financial arrangement and a willingness to supply a fraudulent notary stamp. This isn't a case of someone who pretended to be a friend while secretly planning harm. Meg may have genuinely valued the friendship and still made the choices she made. People are capable of compartmentalizing that completely, of holding authentic affection alongside deliberate betrayal, and the dissonance doesn't always produce visible cracks. Clara looked for cracks for 11 years and didn't find them, not because she wasn't perceptive, but because there may not have been any. What the story ultimately exposes is the cumulative effect of deference. Clara deferred to Dana's management role after their father died. Their mother deferred when papers were placed in front of her at the kitchen table. Gerald Holt deferred when Dana said she'd send documentation and then didn't follow up immediately. None of these deferrals was unreasonable in isolation. Each made sense given what each person knew. Together they created the space the fraud required, a sustained absence of scrutiny that was never the result of one person's failure, but of how naturally we extend trust to people we know. The recovery, the court order, the restored ownership, the eventual sale, matters less in the end than the specific act Clara committed when she sat at her own kitchen table and built a timeline across 3 pages of legal paper. She did the work that family love usually prevents us from doing. She looked directly at someone she cared for and followed the evidence wherever it led. That's not a small thing. Most people, faced with the same documentation, would have found a reason to hesitate, to explain it away, to wait and see. Clara didn't wait. She verified. She documented. She called the right people in the right order. That discipline, brought to bear against someone she'd loved her entire life, is what the story is really about. What stays with me about Clara's story is not the fraud, or even Meg's betrayal, it's that kitchen table. The ordinary pine table where a daughter spread papers in front of her mother and called it a formality. The word formality doing so much work. Covering so much. We extend trust to the people closest to us not because we're foolish, but because trust is the only way families function. You can't live with someone, or love someone, while treating them as a suspect. And yet that same openness is exactly what makes betrayal within families so complete. It doesn't just take money or property. It takes the safety of the ordinary. The kitchen table. The rooster clock. The smell of onions and butter. How do you rebuild the belief that ordinary moments are what they appear to be? I think that's the question Clara is still working on those Sunday visits. And I think most of us, if we're honest, already know something about that particular kind of repair.